For many people working in the entertainment industry, winning an Academy Award is equivalent to that of a badge of honor. It's the ultimate sign that all your hard work as a performer has paid off. Actors over the years as notable as Humphrey Bogart, Dustin Hoffman, and Joaquin Phoenix have all referred to the Oscars at one point or another as being equivalent to that of a piece of unfulfilling froth. The minute those performers were actually recipients of the award, though, they accepted their trophies without even so much as a dart thrown the Academy's way. As the great British director David Lean once said, if you have no hope of getting an Oscar, they're despised. But if you have one, they're important. So, when a person does reject an Oscar, unsurprisingly, it tends to send shockwaves across the industry. However, it's a rare occurrence, having only happened 3 times in history, with the last such example being over 40 years ago. In 1936, in the middle of an ongoing strike between the Writers Guild and the Academy, out of solidarity for his fellow craftsmen, screenwriter Dudley Nichols refused to accept his award for the 1935 John Ford drama The Informer. Nichols was never truly opposed to getting an Oscar, though, and once the strike had subsided, would pick up his trophy at the 1937 ceremony. More infamously, in 1973, when Marlon Brando won Best Actor for The Godfather, instead of showing up to the ceremony, he sent Satching Littlefeather, a Native American civil rights activist and actress, in his stead as a form of protest. This led to one of the Academy's less dignified moments, which is really saying something. And then there was actor George C. Scott, who in 1971 made history when he refused his award for Best Actor for his portrayal of stern General George S. Patton in 1970's Patton. The night Scott win was read by an appropriately stunned Goldie Hawn.
Oh my God. The winner is George C. Scott.
The actor was at home, doing the most appropriate thing anyone would be doing on such a celebratory occasion, watching a hockey game on television. Patton's producer, Frank McCarthy, who had served as a secretary during World War II, accepted the award, but in accordance with Scott's wishes, will return the trophy the following day. So, was Scott's rejection of the Oscar a case of him being a sore loser, or is there more to his story than is being let on? Did he have a noble reason for rejecting his Academy Award? Well, it's complicated, let's just say. Yes, I know I'm taking the easy way out here, but you would probably too if you were in my situation. This video will serve as a career retrospective of George C. Scott, explaining why he rejected the Oscar, as well as providing an overview of the 1971 Best Male Acting race in general. But, before we get to the rest of the video, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe. Also, check out my website at dansden.net, which includes film reviews and podcasts. Anyway, let's find out why that gold statue isn't all it's cracked up to be. So, first, to understand why George C. Scott rejected his Oscar, we need to understand where his career was leading up to Patton. George C. Scott initially had ambitions to be a writer, but eventually realized he'd probably find more success as an actor. Starting out on the New York stage, his feature film debut was the 1959 western The Hanged Tree, where he made a strong first impression as a superstitious faith healer who ended up leading the charge to hang Gary Cooper's character at the end.
If you are sick, come unto me, and I will lay my hands on you, and my hands will make you well.
A few months later, Scott made his feature film breakthrough, playing prosecutor Claude Dancer in Otto Preminger's classic, groundbreaking courtroom drama Anatomy of a Murder. Even in a cast filled with recognizable names, his memorable performance stood out.
I think it would only delay things to file a formal petition, so why don't we just get together and sort of informally agree to ask His Honor for an adjournment, only a day or so, and our doctor can visit with the defendant. I think it would save everyone a great deal of time, don't you, Miss Bigley?
He was showered with praise and received his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. For a young Scott, the idea of winning an Academy Award seemed like a very exciting thing. Unfortunately, he had the misfortune of running across a little chariot roadblock known as William Wyler's Ben-Hur. The 1959 epic practically swept everything at the Oscars, which included Best Supporting Actor, with English actor Hugh Griffith winning for his portrayal of the film's comic relief, Sheik Elderum. For Scott, losing the Oscar was heartbreaking, but it was also the moment he realized, oh, I don't like how the Academy Awards are run at all. Scott disliked the Academy Awards specifically because he saw their extensive media blitz approach as delegitimizing the concept of acting awards in general. As he put it at the time, I came to see it as a fawning Disney meat contest staged every spring. The process was not something with which I could live comfortably. When Scott was nominated again for his portrayal of devious gambler Burt Gordon and Robert Rousing's 1961 film The Hustler,
You think they call Minnesota Fats the best in the country just because you got talent? Nah. Minnesota Fats got more character in one finger than you got in your old skinny body.
he sent a telegram to the Academy asking his name be withdrawn. The Academy responded by telling Scott that despite his objections, his name will remain on the ballot.
What is it you want? What do you want from me?
Scott further reiterated his opinions on the Academy Awards while being interviewed by a writer from the New York Times, stating he believed it encouraged the public to think the award was more important to the actor than the work for which he was nominated. A close friend of Scott's followed that up with, he disliked the whole Hollywood back-patting atmosphere. For the Oscars, you have to throw a few cocktail parties yourself and get people to screenings to take a look at you and all that sort of thing. He told me that the Oscars were just a way for motion picture companies to make more money on the pictures and had little other value. There's a lot of truth to what Scott was rallying against. Historically, many Oscar-nominated films have been seemingly nominated as much for their perceived quality as they have been for the excessive amount of campaigning on the studio's part. The reason for this should be obvious. A film getting a nomination brings it more attention, allowing it to do better at the box office, possibly have a longer shelf life, etc. And if you're a major studio, one way you might succeed at that is by trying to stack the deck in your favor. This was something that Harvey Weinstein was a master at, with his most infamous example probably being Shakespeare in Love winning Best Picture, where he used strong-arm tactics like a blitzkrieg of a press tour, lobbying members, and starting negative whisper campaigns against the other major Oscar frontrunner that season, Saving Private Ryan. But this excessiveness actually goes back even further than that. In the 60s and 70s, the period in particular that Scott was talking about, were notorious for stories of Academy members being bribed with booze and food by studios, all in this attempt to get movies nominated regardless of perceived quality. And if you're wondering if Scott's rejection of the Oscar, which was a case of him being a sore loser, well, here's the thing. Scott wasn't opposed to award shows in general. He attended the Emmys and Tonys several times. And when he didn't, he still accepted his trophies without any ifs or buts. The difference, at least according to Scott anyway, was that awards like the Emmys and Tonys were decided upon by anonymous jurymen, and thus less about putting up FYC campaigns in the newspapers, and more about actually honoring work. His official word in the press at the time was, these are the groups who simply meet, vote, and then announce their awards. That, I feel, is the way it ought to be done, without the contrived suspense of the Oscar ceremony. It should be noted that the Emmys are very similar to the Oscars in their approach to voting. Well, Scott wasn't exactly a fortune teller. Scott went through the rest of the 1960s without an Oscar nomination. He gave an iconic performance in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove.
Mr. President, I'm beginning to smell a big fat commie rat. Suppose we kiss off his lying about that fourth plane, just looking for an excuse to clobber us. If the spaghetti hits the fan now, we're in trouble.
But despite that film receiving 4 Oscar nominations, including one for Peter Sellers in the title role, Scott was not one of them. Scott said following his lack of a nomination for Strangelove, I don't think I'll ever be nominated again. Oh, if only you knew. Part of the reason for the lack of nominations may have been because Scott wasn't yet a movie star. He was certainly a respected actor, but he was more committed to television and stage work then, and only appeared in films relatively sporadically in the 1960s. One of those shows was the one-season series East Side, West Side, where Scott played a social worker in New York who tried to solve the problems of his various clients every episode. It was a groundbreaking, critically acclaimed program, shot on location in New York, and a wonderful showcase for Scott's more modernistic, realistic style of acting.
He screams for help, and then when you start to pull him out, he puts up a fight. Why? Because he doesn't want to be saved? Don't panic now, Mr. Bailey. You want it.
Tackling such dark subject matter as prostitution and racism in the slums. Despite this, though, it wasn't much of a success, often receiving low ratings and running across the iris of sponsors who wanted cleaner programming. Many of the films Scott took in the 60s and even the 70s often involved him disappearing into a role by subtly applying makeup work to his face, be it the hair or beard, and trying out different voice inflections. It wasn't exactly the Lee Strasberg style method acting, as from what I've read, Scott was actually self-trained, but watching these movies, I sometimes got the impression that he was trying to get into the heads of his main characters, even when the script wouldn't necessarily allow him. Irvin Kershner's enjoyable 1967 road comedy, The Flim Flam Man, cast George C. Scott, then a 40-year-old, as a rascally old veteran con man with a southern twang.
Well, our experience this evening suggests that the territory is ripe for exploitation. You know the territory, and I know how to exploit.
And Anthony Harvey's 1971 delightfully weird adaptation of the mystery comedy play They Might Be Giants. Yes, that is where the name of the band comes from. George C. Scott played a depressed man who, after the death of his wife, retreats into a fantasy world where he believes he is Sherlock Holmes, complete with a faux British accent and a scholarly tone to his voice.
Why? Because you won't talk?
Typical. Why is it analysts can't ever analyze?
Even something as poor as Gord Champion's 1974 crime comedy Bank Shot saw Scott play his character with bushy eyebrows and a lisp.
Okay. I've seen some banks that ought to be robbed, and I've seen some banks that ought not to be robbed. And of all the banks that ought not to be robbed, this bank is number one on the list.
Perhaps best of all, though, was Robert Wise's dull 1975 historical disaster film, The Hindenburg, in which Scott gave a performance that could be described as paycheck, please.
Your son died for Hitler. Isn't that enough for you?
Plenty. I don't want 97 more dead on the ship.
Heck, he even sang and spoke Italian in the 1964 film, The Yellow Rolls Royce. And was in a 1966 sex comedy called Not With My Wife You Don't, with Tony Curtis.
There I was. Flat on my back in that bug-infested hospital. No color television, no plug for my electric toothbrush. Is hell, I'm telling you, it's pure hell.
There's nothing transformative about Scott in this film, but in one scene, he dresses up in a Japanese kimono and briefly puts on an accent of sorts. Yeah. Some things are probably better left in the past. Then there was 1970's Patton, Scott's true anointment as a movie star. For George C. Scott, a former Marine veteran himself, the role of General George S. Patton was one that he felt he was born to play. True to his nature of being committed to his art as an actor, he ordered up old newsreels from World War II and watched them multiple times. He read 13 Patton biographies, had his dentist mold him a set of caps to duplicate Patton's teeth, shaved his head, and wore a wig of white fuzz. Franklin J. Schaffer's Patton is a very well-made movie, and a strong character study. There are certainly elements of it that have a distasteful, rah rah rah, we're going to win American pro-war attitude, which is often the case with war movies set during World War II. In general, though, the film is a lot more open-minded with its portrayal of the preparation of war and the effect it has on people. One of the things working in the film's favor is George C. Scott's lead performance, which is astonishing. It's a complex performance, with Scott in the film perfectly conveying Patton's own multitudes as a person, his commanding presence, his obsession with war, his recklessness, his hatred of cowardice, even the times he was actually friendly to people. Scott just doesn't shine during the moments where Patton gets angry or yells, of which there are plenty.
Come on, you bastards! Take a shot at me right in the nose!
But also the quiet scenes, where he's allowed to rely more on his physical attributes rather than his voice. His back and forth scenes with Carl Malton's General Omar R. Bradley capture the gentleman's differing approaches to the battlefield. And it helps that Image H. North and Francis Ford Coppola, pre-Godfather screenplay, gives him plenty of material to chew on.
It's the pomp and toils of war. Have I fought and strove and perished countless times upon the star.
So, before we get to Scott's actual Oscar campaign, quote-unquote, I thought it would be important if I talked about the other actors in the Best Acting category that year. Nominated alongside George C. Scott for Best Actor for Patton were Melvyn Douglas and Gilbert Cates' I Never Sang for My Father, as an elderly businessman who loses his wife and tries to reconnect with his estranged son, played by Gene Hackman.
That was taken just about the time he got married. Oh, he was a fine-looking man before he started drinking. Big, square, high color.
James Earl Jones reprising his Tony Award-winning performance in Martin Ritt's The Great White Hope, as a black boxer in the 1910s who faces racial discrimination, both on and off the ring.
You tell me you praying him? You expect I'm gonna say thank you, Reverend, you ain't praying for me. It ain't, Lord, don't let that peck break his nose. Or Lord, let him get out of town and not get shot at.
Jack Nicholson in a career-defining performance, and Bob Rafelson's 5 Easy Pieces.
I don't know if you'd be particularly interested in hearing anything about me. My life, most of it doesn't add up to much that I could relate as a way of life that you'd approve of.
And Ryan O'Neal in the year's biggest hit, Arthur Hiller's romantic weepy love story.
Hey, do I call up my father on the phone? Do I bill and coo and say, I love you, Phil, I love you, Phil?
So, while Scott was the presumed best actor frontrunner the entire season, and many people making predictions at the time had him at number 1, there were some who thought that maybe Melvyn Douglas could win Best Actor. The thinking appears to have been driven by the belief that since George C. Scott is making such a fuss about the Oscar, why don't they give it to the next, even older, respected veteran? After all, that narrative had served John Wayne well the previous year with True Grit. This turned out to be quite incorrect. Douglas had already won Best Supporting Actor in 1964 for his performance in the Paul Newman film HUD, so the incentive to give another award so soon in a much more competitive category was maybe not so high. Douglas himself would eventually win his second Oscar for a supporting performance as elderly business mogul Ben Rann in 1979's Being There. Ultimately though, even with all that speculation, there was no question. George C. Scott was going to win. He had dominated the Precursor Awards, and it was about as perfect as an Oscar-winning role gets. He's in just about every single scene, and the movie doesn't functionally work without him. And Patton was victorious that Oscar night, winning 7 awards, which included Best Picture and Best Director. But even if Patton hadn't gotten either of those awards, it's still easy to see Scott winning. He was just that undeniable. But Scott himself again didn't want the award, telling the Associated Press, life isn't a race, it's a war of survival, and there are many who get crippled and injured along the way. And because it's not a race, I don't consider myself in competition with my fellow actors for awards or recognition. Just as he had done in 1962, he also sent a telegram to the Academy the day the nominations were announced on February 22nd, which read, peculiar as it may seem, I mean no offense to the Academy. I simply do not wish to be involved. I will not attend the ceremony, nor will any legitimate representation of mine attend.
Jeez, I'm sick of that.
Scott, in general, became a hot property thanks to Patton's success and him turning down the Oscar, when Scott's then-wife, actress Colleen Dewhurst, accepted his trophy for Best Actor for Patton at the New York Film Critics Circle Awards. She said George thought it was the only award worth having. Scott was interviewed for 60 Minutes and made the cover of Time magazine, which features my favorite quote associated with this entire saga. I don't give a damn about the Oscar. I'm making too much money. I guess that explains why he was the voice of a villainous smoke cloud in cartoon All-Stars to the Rescue.
You were running from a rabbit? He's a cartoon.
Look who's talking.
Actually, that might be his peak as an actor. Well, it's either that or the time he got hit by a football.
My groin.
Scott's actions would, however, naturally spark backlash, as anything basically does. The Academy withheld their usual telegram of congratulations for the actor. Well, some people threw out this idea that Scott's rejection of the Oscar was his own version of shadow campaigning. All these press interviews, where he gave similar meat parade type quotes, were essentially a game of 4D chess. Obviously, with hindsight, we know this wasn't true. But at the time, nobody knew how to react to this unusual anti-Oscar approach. Yes, Dudley Nichols had rejected an Oscar, but that was under special circumstances. This was the first time that someone who was an Oscar frontrunner had made his displeasure known to such a large degree. Still, it was a bit of a stretch to say that George C. Scott was doing shadow campaigning when he had made it abundantly clear that he wasn't. I mean, he had already said no before. Wasn't that enough for the press? Surprisingly, most of Scott's fellow nominees had nothing but good things to say about him and his performance as Patton, with a lot of, hey, he was great in that film, good for him. On the whole, though, opinions were mixed. Some people blasted Scott, while others applauded him for his bravery. Actor Anthony Quinn said at a convention regarding George C. Scott, "I support him. I don't necessarily agree with what he says, but he should speak out his thoughts. If that's the way he feels, I cannot criticize him." Another anonymous actor at the same convention said, "Scott is a fool, and making a lot of noise for no purpose. But I'm a member of the Academy, and I have a vote. When it comes time for me to vote for Best Actor, my only thought will be for what George put up there on the screen, not about his popping off." I think my favorite of the responses I was able to find, though, came from actor Gary Merrill, who sent Scott a telegram that simply read, "You are beautiful." If only I had put a "so" before the beautiful, it would have been perfect. So, now that I've gone through and explained the whole story of George C. Scott's Oscar escapades, I have to answer the question, was George C. Scott wrong to reject the Oscar? Well, no. Obviously, it was his decision. He could do whatever he wanted. George C. Scott himself was quite the character. If you knew anything about the man, then you realize him rejecting the Oscar fits right in with his personality, which was difficult to say the least. He clashed with producers, demanded copious amounts of rewrites when he didn't like something, and often had a reputation for showing up late to set, which cost him a couple of notable films, including the Eli Wallach art collector role in 1966's How to Steal a Million. He was also a massively mean drunk, often drowning his sorrow in beers. There are stories out there of him relapsing and getting better, and then going back to drinking again, some of which just sound horrible. For example, he started an affair with actress Ava Gardner on the set of John Huston's 1966 hysterical epic, The Bible in the Beginning, and then beat her in a drunken rage, which is enough to make me look down on him as a person. But also, anytime I've watched an interview with Scott, he seemed very complimentary of the people he worked with. Maybe he was just putting on a happy face, or had gotten sober. I don't know. And even considering his problematic personal life, when George C. Scott actually showed up to set, he was a superb actor. Yes, he wasn't afraid to play silly parts, or do paycheck roles, but with a few exceptions here or there, he seemed to be pretty locked in. I watched practically Scott's entire theatrical filmography for this video, and in the 1977 Ernest Hemingway adaptation Island of the Streams, he actually made me cry, which is not something that every single actor can lay claim to. And I think it was that ambition to be a serious actor that initially really turned Scott off to the Academy Awards. He saw himself as a rebel. Why did he want to be recognized by a phony, hoity-toity awards show when they've already disappointed him once before? Plus, I do have to give it to Scott that he was consistent. From everything I read, he never went back to collect his Oscar, nor did he make much of a deal out of it when asked about it in interviews.
About the Oscars, gee whiz, I don't like to be paraded as meat. I'm not in the butcher business, and that's really my
That's my feeling about it.
For the Academy, Scott's win would be seen as a growing up moment for the organization, showing that they rewarded an actor for their performance and not dismiss them because of any outrageous statements they might have made. Well, sort of. The Academy Awards continued to make plenty of confounding mistakes after Patton. Still, I was actually surprised by how many articles I read where people said, I don't like Scott's actions, but I'll still vote for him if I think the performance is worthy. Even former Academy President Gregory Peck, who called Scott an exhibitionist, said to consider his acting. It was also important in spicing up what otherwise seemed like a typical Academy Awards ceremony. Scott would be nominated one more time the following year for the Arthur Hiller directed, Patty Chayefsky scripted, amazingly bizarre black comedy The Hospital.
I'm an only child of a lower middle class people. I was the glory of my parents, my son the doctor, you know.
Scott didn't attend that ceremony, and wise on his part, didn't make any bones about his nomination period. George C. Scott was an incredible actor with an eclectic assortment of roles. He was a Native American with an eye patch in Firestarter, which was a real choice. He played one of the best live-action Scrooges. He was the voice of the main villain in The Rescuers Down Under, a childhood staple of mine. He made a movie where he unwittingly trained a dolphin to kill the President of the United States. You know, despite Day of the Dolphin containing one of the greatest taglines ever, which isn't even accurate, but whatever, it could actually stand to be a little weirder than it is.
Why is man good?
One of his last roles was as the curmudgeonly supportive grandfather in Angus, a movie I remember watching as a kid, and he was even the star of his own sitcom, Mr. President.
They can discuss boys.
Yes, this was a thing, and yes, I watched 5 episodes of it. I'd say that's time well spent. He may have come off as petty about the Academy Awards, and I can't excuse some of his behavior. At the same time, though, to me, he's the perfect embodiment of the human experience. Anyway, until we meet again, see you next time, guys.